Hi, everybody. Welcome back. How's your preparation going? I'm hoping by this stage, as we're sort of halfway through our preparation period, that you are feeling really confident, that you're kind of working out where the gaps in your knowledge might be, and beginning to work really particularly to plug those little holes so that you feel that you can work with the play really flexibly. Something that I started in my class this week that you might like to create at home is a little bit of a data wall. So if you had like a little notice board or something in your room at home, all you're going to aim to create using a set of Post-it notes is a set of summaries. So choose a color for characters and summarize each of the characters on no more than one Post-it note. And when you do that, you are looking for changes in their nature as the story progresses. You're looking at key poetic devices or literary devices used by that character or by Shakespeare to develop that character. And maybe the most pivotal scenes for that character. So the moment where they reach their anagnorisis. So that word refers, of course, to a character realizing that they have been responsible for their own downfall. So hamartia is their fatal flaw, and anagnorisis is the moment that they realize that they are responsible, so that their own hamartia has undone them. Then you could create a Post-it note summary of the plot. You could create a set of Post-it note flashcards for the literary devices, just to build your knowledge of those, and perhaps a set of Post-it note flashcards for themes. And each day you could rearrange the themes and just think about the way that the order of those themes, depending on the order that they land in, how could you use them? What connection could you draw between those two themes in a way that you maybe hadn't explored before? So I'm going to film another thematic analysis tutorial today. And basically after this, I'm probably going to be looking at key ideas like symbols and motifs. And then I'm going to move into specifically our essay writing. Like to say thanks for the love. We're up to about 8 subscribers, which is huge. But I do hope that as more of you come on board and begin to work with the tutorials, that you do find them useful, and that they are building your ability to independently analyze the script and independently determine what you would answer or how you would evaluate the text. So that's the important thing. I'm giving you the tools to do it yourself, because ultimately you have got to be able to function from start to finish without feeling like there's something that you could have done better if you'd had access to your teacher in the exam. Okay, so today I'm going to start with, or I'm going to look at, analysis of the theme of agency. So in Macbeth, the theme of agency is essentially like a neat, easy way to refer to that idea of fate versus free will. So agency is about our ability to control our actions, or our desire to control our actions. So if we were to think about agency, we could connect that big idea to ideas like selfishness, ambition, potentially violence, or rather violent acts. You could look at it in terms of crime, because each of those big ideas draw their origins from the idea that Macbeth made a decision that went against perhaps what God had intended for him. Okay, so the idea of agency and controlling your actions yourself, sometimes against your better judgment or to your own detriment, is really central. So when you think about this idea, what I want you to do is connect a number of smaller themes, or a number of smaller ideas that you've probably discussed with your teacher and with your friends, to that idea of, okay, so what happened when Macbeth chose to act, and how does that reflect moving away from maybe God's plan? Alrighty, so let's have a look at some ways that we could analyze the theme of agency by looking at the vehicles that will carry it through the text. Okay, so here we go. So as I mentioned, this is the idea of fate versus free will. So we're really thinking about the big idea of how Macbeth's actions subvert what should have been happening in society, subvert what a good Christian audience of the Jacobean era would have expected from a king. Okay, so when we think about the outcome of agency in this story, or rather, when we think about what Shakespeare wants us to take away from the outcome of the idea of agency, you've got to look at how the characters' stories finish. Okay, so right back when I looked at the introduction to thematic analysis, I talked about that idea of theme plus character's outcome equals author's intent. Okay, so theme plus character's outcome equals author's intent. So if I was to look at something like free will, then we would say free will plus Macbeth's downfall positions the audience to understand that God has a plan for you, and that as good Christians, God's plan is what is best for not only the individual, but society as a whole. And so at the time that Shakespeare is writing, where we have a Christian king who is very suspicious of witches, who has been actively persecuting them, who has had a couple of assassination plots from nefarious, underhanded characters, it is important for Shakespeare to reinforce that idea that God's plan, which sees King James as the head of the Church of England and the head of the country as God's chosen vessel on earth, and that his position there is legitimate, and that everything will be as it should be if we don't disturb that natural order. When Macbeth chooses to kill a king and disrupt that natural order, he takes his agency into his own hands, and he disrupts God's plan. Now, as society evolved and literature evolved, we saw free will viewed much more positively in many other eras of literature, but certainly at the time that Shakespeare's writing, the idea of God's plan and the legitimacy of James's rule because of God's plan is central to this. So free will right now, particularly if you're the king, come by your throne illegitimately, is not a great thing. Okay, so there are a number of different vehicles that we could explore as students of the text that actually help develop this idea of fate versus free will. So the most obvious one, and I'll keep coming back to this with thematic analysis, is characterization. So again, remember, characters don't exist in isolation. It's important to consider the relationships between them, the contrast between them, where it is that they are in conflict and what actually causes that conflict. So the point I would make as far as looking at the idea of agency through characterization is the juxtaposition of Macbeth against Duncan and then eventually Malcolm. So when we look at the rightful king, Duncan, he is represented as abiding by God's will, and the goodness of that comes through in the fact that he's quite authentically chivalrous. Okay, so he's in opposition to the King of Norway, and he is engaged in a battle. When he sees his soldiers and his generals fighting hard for him, he rewards them. He enjoys. He lauds them with praise. He celebrates their successes. He gives them titles. He wants to come and be hospitable with them. I'll come to your home and stay the night with you. And so the representation there is, God's will in choosing Duncan as a legitimate king creates a land that is prosperous and ultimately successful. So when we juxtapose Macbeth against Duncan, what we should see is a whole lot of opposites. So Duncan didn't listen to witches. Macbeth listens to witches. And I'm going to talk more about the witches and the weird sister illusion later on. But Duncan doesn't listen to the witches, but Macbeth does. When Macbeth listens to the witches, he is given a message that helps to actually legitimize his own failings, the weaker parts of his own character. And in doing that, he begins to present an image of a king or a representation of authority that is different from Duncan's. Okay, now If this was not a tragedy, if Macbeth went to war and won great success, then we would be getting a really different message. But it doesn't end differently. From the moment that he begins to act on spurious information from the witches, he begins to act for his own selfish gain. He takes his agency into his own hands, and his downward trajectory starts. All right. It is only through the restoration of order, the restoration of natural justice, which ultimately is restoring the legitimate line, that we see that this story come to an end. Okay, so important thing is to think about juxtaposition. We can see that in addition to being selfishly motivated, he's also two-faced. So the idea of deception and deceit is present all the way through Macbeth's story. We get it in his references to darkness to cover his actions in Act 1 and Act 2 and in Act 3. And that idea of let the night hide what I'm doing so that I can still show my face in public the next day is an idea of pretense or of deceit. We see that for the first time, probably, well, he thinks it certainly in Act 1, Scene 3. Lady Macbeth names it in Act 1, Scene 5. And, ultimately, Macbeth takes that on board by Act 1, Scene 7 before we actually kill Duncan. Lady Macbeth's character arc, while she certainly... her downfall parallels Macbeth's, hers is not aimed in quite the same way. So Lady Macbeth's character arc is a cautionary tale. So what that basically means is you're supposed to look at that, look at what happens as a direct result of her acting independently, and acknowledge that there was something in that for each of us and that we shouldn't really do that. And that's true of Macbeth's as well. But his downfall doesn't just impact himself, it impacts his whole kingdom. Lady Macbeth is quite personal. So even if you don't think that you had any real authority in the world, taking something from Lady Macbeth's story would educate you. So we see Lady Macbeth prepared to do just about anything, to take agency over her actions and do anything. What cannot we do what cannot you and I perform against the unguarded Duncan? So who cares what people think? We've got control of ourselves. But by Act 5, it's really clear that the impact of her actions has actually eroded her sense of sanity, eroded her sense of reality, and she isn't able to cope with the consequences. And we see that in the fact that she's going through the motions of being alive, sleepwalking, that she is confessing little parts of crimes in a strange way, and that ultimately she's engaged in this sort of manic and obsessive compulsive behavior. It is interesting to note, and I think this is something you could really go and explore. When we talk about fate versus free will, and specifically in the Christian context, God's plan versus man's plan, go and have a look at how infrequently Macbeth and Lady Macbeth reference God. Okay, so they do certainly reference other spiritual bodies, but not God. So it's interesting that by Act 5, when the doctor is engaged to heal her, it is the doctor who says it's not me that she needs to confess. So it's a recognition then that Lady Macbeth's actions can only actually be fixed, that she can actually only be absolved of the damage of her actions by realigning her life to the expectations of the church, so by confessing. So go and have a look at that. Just choose a different color, something you haven't used before, and see how many references to God you can actually find and see what that reveals to you. Okay. So in addition to characterization, we can also look at, that's the wrong way. There we go. We can also look at some stylistic devices. Of course, we can look at stylistic devices. I mean, characters are stylistic devices, and so too is the idea of juxtaposition. But if you wanted to make an argument using characters, characterization, and relationships, then another one that you could do would be specifically looking at your literary devices. The first one I've made there is the use of illusion. So we've talked in a previous tutorial about the importance of the name Weird Sisters and how that links to the Greek mythological representation of the fates. Now, those three crones, those 3 old women, measured the length of your life, cut your thread, and your life length was predetermined. Now, while a Shakespearean audience would certainly have understood a reference to Greek mythology, they're not necessarily handing their lives over to false gods, because remember, Christianity would have then suggested that the Roman and Greek gods were false idols. You're not handing your life over to the Greek gods. You have to trust in God's plan as a Christian member of a Christian audience. So rather than sustain or in addition to having the allusion to Greek mythology and to the witches through the word weird, we also have the reference to them specifically as witches, as hags, as unnatural creatures who are not of this world. And that influence, that idea that they're not quite who they should be, that they're somehow supernatural, means that their influence on Macbeth is negative. Okay, so what does that mean? Yes, I've got supernatural power. Like if I believe in God, I believe God has divine power. If I was living in Greece, I would have believed that the fates had that control over my life. If I am in England in the 1600s, then I believe that God maps that path out for me. The idea that I would try and change my path by listening to untrustworthy witches would suggest that I am not a good Christian, but it would definitely, more importantly, suggest that I am not fit to rule. So for a king to actually listen to witches is really problematic. And of course, Shakespeare's doing that on purpose to appeal to James. But we can actually see this idea of the witches subverting God's plan in the panicked interaction that Lady Macbeth and Macbeth have immediately following Duncan's murder. Macbeth talks about the fact that he's unable to say amen to the guards talking in their sleep. That lack of ability, that panic that he could not say amen, and that then Macbeth had murdered sleep, is an idea that he can't actually align himself to God's authority. He can't say the words. To say the words will ultimately be setting himself up to be damned. Okay, so think about that. That's picking up on that imagery of God. The last one that I would mention, although there's plenty more, but that's enough for today, is this idea, this literary device called chiasmus. Now, chiasmus is a literary device where the organization of the words in the first part of the sentence are reversed in the second part. And as is the case with all literary devices, this is done to create an effect. Now, in the particular effect of fair is foul and foul is fair, we actually capture the idea that you can't trust what you're seeing. So there's deceit at its heart. And it also suggests that idea of what is being offered to you that appears to be worthwhile and good is actually problematic. Okay, that what the witches suggest, which is not what God had planned, is ultimately going to undermine your path. And again, because we know that chiasmus used by the witches whose most relevant influence is on Macbeth, and that Macbeth's character is ultimately beheaded and killed, would suggest that the use of it is negative. One thing I forgot that I actually had added to this slide is the reference to soliloquies. So soliloquies are actually a stylistic device of a play. And Macbeth has 7 of them across the course of the whole play. Okay, so here is another thing you could go and do. Grab yourself a Post-it note color that you haven't used before. Reference the 7 soliloquies and examine what it is that each of them reveal about Macbeth's character. Now, the very first of his soliloquies actually focuses on his fear and his fear about himself. So the fear about the fact that when he heard the idea that he could be king, he didn't automatically reject the idea of killing the king. He actually was prepared to entertain it. So a man who is prepared to entertain killing a king, a kinsman, a friend, someone who's just given you 2, titles, would suggest that you are prepared to take control of your own life, but that ultimately you really probably shouldn't be in charge of the country. And then as the play progresses, each of these soliloquies reveals something a little extra about his greed and his ambition. So if I was unpacking the theme of agency, I might have connected it to the synonyms of fate versus free will, freedom, selfishness, greed, ambition, because they're all very self-centered actions. And so if I'm self-centered, then I'm trying to take control of my own agency and act in my best interest rather than the interest of others. I could actually build three completely different arguments about the importance of agency, the centralness of agency to the play by looking at characterization, of course. I mean, a play that's performed for you by characters, by actors playing characters, you've always going to look at characterization. So we're going to look at characterization, including relationships and juxtaposition. I'm going to look at literary devices, things like chiasmus and illusion. And I'm going to look at stylistic devices, something like soliloquies or motifs, references to God, and see what that actually can tell me about Shakespeare's use of the theme of fate versus free will and how I, as an audience member, am positioned to view that. Okay, so by this time in your preparation, you are beginning to engage with a whole lot of practice questions. We've provided you with probably at least 20 already. And one of the things that I've suggested that you do as part of your preparation is to engage in some synonym study. Okay, so if you were to look at a word like agency, it will never hurt you to go to a thesaurus and to find a whole lot of different words that mean the same thing. It's actually going to support you to be able to make nuanced and evaluative arguments because you will have other words to use. And each of those words will add a little extra dimension to your analysis of the stylistic devices that built that theme in the text. Okay. So the next time we talk about Macbeth, we're going to be looking probably just specifically tying up the idea of symbols and motifs, although we've certainly talked about that before. And then we're focused entirely on the process of analysis and the deconstruction of our text, not just to generally understand it, but to specifically address the requirements of a question and what we can do to prepare a really excellent answer. So last chance, maybe, if you have anything that you would really like me to do a tutorial on, a character that you'd really like me to unpack, a word whose etymology you would like to explore, please let me know either in the comments below or in an email to me, and I will prepare a tutorial to support specifically what you need. Until next time, see you later.